think in particular Canadians are interested in what that means in a trade context.
Yeah.
And in particular, looking for some meat on the bone on what their policies might look like in that respect. In your conversations with people in her vice presidential office or the Senate who are close to her campaign, do you have any indication about where she stands, for example, on CUSMA or the new NAFTA? Because she was one of only 10 senators to vote against it.
Yes, she was. And I think that's a really important discussion for us to continue to have with her. But I think it's important for Canadians to remember that she voted against it explicitly because she felt it didn't go far enough on the environment. It wasn't because she was anti-trade with Canada or anti-trade with Canada and Mexico. And she just met the Prime Minister in Philadelphia in June, and one of the topics that they talked about for quite some time were resilient supply chains between Canada and U.S. and making sure that we are building sort of an economy where we are supplying each other what we need for both of us to be more resilient in a moment of a fair bit of economic and global uncertainty. So that's a good sign, and I took that very positively. She's also from California, which has a massive, massive trading relationship with Canada, $44 billion a year. And her vice president pick is a huge proponent of the Canada-U.S. economic relationship. You know, he's a regular attendee at Canada Day events in Minneapolis. When the border was closed for COVID, after President Biden took the last of the restrictions off of personal travel, he declared a statewide Welcome Canadian Travelers Day. And he sort of celebrated the return of Canadians to Minnesota, not just for trade, but also people-to-people ties and vacationers and hockey teams and, you know, all of it. And I think that's something that we should be optimistic about, that he has that level of enthusiasm.
I think he was even in Ontario pretty recently to meet with Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Have you had any conversations with the people around him since he became the vice presidential pick on this ticket? Because it's one thing to represent the interests of Minnesotans. It's another to try and reflect this whole room.
Yeah, so our consulate general in Minneapolis has talked to the people that are around him in Minneapolis. Who his people are at the national level is something we're still trying to, fully understand. And that's, again, one of the reasons that we're here this week. One of the things that one of our objectives is to ask a lot of questions about that, like who are going to be supporting the vice presidential nominee in the Democratic Party. And chances are we probably know many of them, so we just need to figure out who they are and make sure that we're keeping those lines of communication as open as possible. I met with him in June, Governor Walz, and we had a great discussion. He sent me a vanity plate from Minnesota with Hillman on it and like a little note extolling the benefits of the Canada-U.S. relationship. So again, I think we're starting from a very good position, but you're right. We have to remain vigilant always.
Do you think that the U.S. has become, I spoke to your predecessor once, Mr. McNaughton, former Ambassador McNaughton, who really did have the sense that the country has become more protectionist, right? Since Donald Trump, but through him and straight into this administration. Do you think this country is more protectionist than it was, let's say, 15 years ago?
So I've been doing, trade with the United States for my entire career. And the United States has always been protectionist in my experience. I think what we have are moments of sort of increased policy protectionism and then moments of slight decreases and increases and decreases. But they are fundamentally interested in, because of the size of their economy, they don't need to trade in the way that we do in order to maintain a strong economic footprint. They have just a very different profile economically than we do. And often I don't think they're necessarily trying to exclude Canada per se. They're just very interested in making sure that they are doing as much at home as they possibly can. And that leads to protectionist policies. And that's why it's important for us to always kind of go back to the facts with them and say, okay, you may want to disentangle yourself from trade dependence on China. You may want to disentangle yourself from other trading partners. But the Canada-U.S. integration is deeply to your benefit, and this is why. And we spent a lot of time doing that, but just to really put a fine point on your question, I think right now is a protectionist moment in the United States for both parties, but it's not the first time it's been like this. It ebbs and flows.
I wanted to quickly ask you before I let you go about a specific example where Canada is the focus, and that's softwood lumber.
Yeah.
They just last week announced a doubling of the tariff. They signaled back in February that this would essentially be the case. Why has Canada failed to convince them not to do that in the interim?
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible for us to do that based on the way that the laws around this kind of tariff are put together. They started an investigation. The investigation had certain findings, and there's a path that these processes go on that just doesn't have a lot of off-ramps. Unfortunately, that is the case. We're very disappointed in this finding. We're very disappointed in its consequences. We will fight it under the NAFTA. We will fight it in U.S. domestic court. And ultimately, we need to get to the table and negotiate a softwood lumber agreement with them. But we have had very little uptake from the Americans.
I wanted to ask, what is your sense? Like, why aren't they willing to come to the table? And is there merit to what they're putting on the table, which is that Canada basically subsidizes its lumber industry to the detriment of Americans?
So to that point, that is incorrect. Canada has a very different regime for how we own, or for land ownership that is exploited for timber. A lot of it, or the majority of it in Canada, is public land. The majority of it in the United States is private land. But that doesn't mean it's subsidized. Ownership does not yield subsidization.
That's what they claim. Basically, they get a discount from the province.
That's what they claim. That's what historically they've always been unable to prove. Unfortunately, the system puts the tariffs in place first, then we have to fight to get them off with the facts. And we've been doing this, unfortunately, for a very long time. And the only way around it is to come to a negotiated solution. We've been raising the issue with the Americans for years, well, at least a couple of years, saying we want to get to the table. We can get to the table with you. We should do a negotiation. And the challenge is that unless the U.S. industry is willing to participate in that negotiation, the U.S. government can't make it happen. And so we're not there yet. I'm hopeful that through this cycle of litigation and Canada vindicating its position over and over again, that we will eventually get there. But it's very frustrating.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Ambassador, thanks very much for the time. I appreciate it. Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman.